Camelot. It's the word that hangs over the entire second half of the 20th century in America.
It really is.
You say JFK, and your brain immediately conjures up this
Right.
whole montage, right? The sailing trips, the white-tie dinners, the kids playing under the desk in the Oval Office.
That overwhelming sense of youth and vigor, it felt like American royalty.
A brief, shining moment of perfection,
Wow.
and then the gunshot in Dallas just shatters it all.
It is the ultimate American myth. But, the problem with myths is that they tend to flatten the humanity out of the subject.
Right.
And if we really look at the stack of sources we've pulled for this deep dive, the medical archives, the declassified CIA cables, transcripts from the XCOM meetings, that Camelot image, it isn't just a simplification.
Yeah.
It's a deliberate construction. I mean, it's a mask.
And a heavy one at that. Because the reality behind that mask, it wasn't a fairy tale. Not even close.
No.
It was a man in constant, agonizing physical pain, popping pills just to get through a press conference.
And it was a presidency that didn't just happen to coincide with the Cold War. It was defined by a series of near-apocalyptic crises that Kennedy barely managed to navigate.
Exactly. The icon on the half-dollar coin is stoic. He's frozen in time. But the man of these documents is frantic, calculating, often really, really sick, and just operating under immense pressure.
Precisely. So today we want to move past the tragedy in Dallas. We want to understand the entire arc, from, the sickly second son to the hardened cold warrior.
And the sources we're working with are pretty substantial. We're not just looking at biographies here. We've got the 1960 election data, which breaks down the voting margins county by county.
Super granular stuff.
Yeah. And we have the text of National Security Action Memorandum 263 regarding Vietnam, which is absolutely crucial later on, and the post-assassination interviews that helped build the legend in the first place.
It's just this massive generational shift to unpack. You have to remember, JFK was the first president born in the 20th century.
The youngest elected to the office.
Yeah, the youngest elected, and the first Roman Catholic. When he took that oath, it wasn't just a change of administration. It was a cultural changing of the guard.
But to understand how he even got to that podium, you have to look at the machinery that put him there.
Oh, yeah.
You can't talk about Jack without talking about the Kennedy machine, and specifically, the architect of it all, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr.
Joseph Hassier is a fascinating character study all on his own. He wasn't just rich, he was, one of the wealthiest men in America. He became the youngest bank president in the country at age 25.
25? That's incredible.
He made a fortune in Hollywood production, liquor importation after Prohibition, and, famously, the stock market.
He's the guy who pulled his assets out right before the 1929 crash, right?
That's the one. He said he knew it was time to get out when his shoeshine boy started giving him stock tips. His famous line was, "Only a fool holds out for the top dollar."
So he had the money, but he was obsessed with legitimacy, with power. He wanted a Kennedy in the White House. But the thing that always strikes me when looking at the early family dynamic is that Jack, he wasn't the plan. He wasn't the designated heir.
Not at all. That burden fell on Joseph Jr., the eldest son.
The golden boy.
Joe Jr. was the prototype. He was bigger, stronger, more charismatic, more extroverted. Jack was the scrawny, bookish second son. He was the one reading history in the corner, while Joe Jr. was, leading the football game. Joe Sr. had entirely pinned his presidential ambitions on Joe Jr.
Until 1944.
Right, Operation Aphrodite. It was a secret, incredibly high-risk mission in World War II.
A drone mission, basically.
Yeah, one of the very first. Joe Jr. was piloting a bomber plane packed with explosives, intended to be remotely guided into V3 cannon sites in France. He was supposed to bail out before it hit the target.
But the plane exploded prematurely.
Over the English Channel, he never had a chance.
And in that one instant, the entire weight of the dynasty,
Yeah.
all that ambition, all that pressure, it just shifts.
It falls right onto Jack's shoulders. And it reminds me of that quote from Joe Sr. when he started running Jack's first congressional campaign a few years later. He said, "We're going to sell Jack like soap flakes."
Such a brutal, honest line.
It is, but it captures the strategy perfectly. It was really the birth of modern political packaging. They took this intellectual, somewhat introverted young man, and they packaged him as a war hero and a man of the people.
But the product they were selling had some serious structural flaws that they worked tirelessly to hide. Which brings us to the medical records. I think most people know Kennedy had a bad back, but the sources here detail a medical history that is, frankly, horrifying.
It wasn't just a stiff lower back, it was a lifetime of agony. As a child, he nearly died of scarlet fever. He had these undiagnosed gastrointestinal issues that left him underweight and weak for years.
But the big one, the one they really hid, was Addison's disease.
Yeah.
That's the failure of the adrenal glands, right?
Yes. Your body just stops producing the hormones needed to regulate blood sugar, blood pressure, your reaction to stress. In the 1940s, that was a death sentence.
So how did he survive it?
The only way he survived was through daily injections of corticosteroids. But one of the side effects of that treatment, a moon face, that fullness in his cheeks that actually made him look healthy and tan on camera.
Wow.
But it was actually a symptom of his medication.
And the back pain was so severe, I read he wore a rigid canvas corset almost every day of his presidency.
He couldn't bend down to put on his own socks. During his time in office, he was being treated by Dr. Max Jacobson, who the press nicknamed Dr. Feelgood.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. He was injecting Kennedy with a cocktail of amphetamines and painkillers just to get him through high-stakes summits and major speeches.
Which really changes how you view his decision-making. I mean, if you're living with that level of pain and you have a disease that's basically telling you your time is short.
It creates a certain urgency, a carpe diem attitude.
Right.
A lot of historians argue that his reckless streak, both in his personal life and with some of his political risks, stemmed from this constant intimacy with mortality. He really didn't expect to live past 45, so he moved fast.
But before the politics, he had to earn his stripes. And despite that sickly label, his service in the Pacific during World War II gave the Kennedy machine the ultimate narrative hook.
PT-109.
PT-109.
The story's cinematic, but when you look at the details, it shows genuine grit. It's August 1943. Kennedy is commanding a patrol torpedo boat in the Solomon Islands.
In the pitch black of night.
In the pitch black of night, a Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri, comes out of nowhere and just smashes right through them, cuts the PT boat in half.
The fuel tanks explode, 2 crewmen die instantly, and the rest are just clinging to the wreckage in the dark.
Right. And this is where the rich kid from Harvard has to make a choice.
And he chooses action.
He gathers the survivors. One of his crewmen, Patrick McMahon, was badly burned and couldn't swim. So Kennedy, the man with the crumbling spine, swam for 4 hours to a nearby island, towing McMahon the entire way.
By biting the strap of McMahon's life jacket.
Exactly. Clenched in his teeth for 4 hours in salt water.
Just incredible.
And when they finally got to the island, it was later nicknamed Plum Pudding Island. There was no food, no water. They were just slowly dying of exposure.
And this leads to my absolute favorite artifact in the Kennedy Library. The coconut.
It sounds like something out of a movie, but it's completely real.
What was the message he carved on it?
He carved, narrow ISL, commander, native knows posit, he can pilot 11 alive, needs small boat. Kennedy?
And he gives it to 2 Solomon Islanders who were working as scouts for the Allies.
Yes, Bukugasa and Aroni Kumana. Their names are often left out of the popular version of the story, but they are the real heroes here.
Without them, Kennedy dies on that island. They took that coconut through enemy-controlled waters to an Australian Coast Watcher base.
Absolutely. They saved the future president, and when Kennedy got back, Joe Sr. made sure that story was everywhere. It was in the New Yorker, Reader's Digest.
It completely neutralized the privileged Playboy attacks.
You can't call a man a soft aristocrat when he's saved his crew from sharks and Japanese destroyers.
So he rides that war hero status into Congress, then the Senate. And that brings us to 1960. The showdown. Kennedy versus Nixon.
On paper, this was Nixon's election to lose. He was the sitting vice president. He had 8 years of foreign policy experience under Eisenhower. He was the heavyweight.
And Kennedy was seen as this young, inexperienced upstart.
Yeah. But 1960 introduced a new variable that Nixon completely failed to understand.
Television.
Television. The first televised presidential debate is probably the most analyzed hour in the history of political communication.
It's the perfect case study, and the medium is the message.
Totally. If you look at the transcripts or if you were listening on the radio that night, Nixon actually did very well. His arguments were substantive, his rebuttals were sharp.
And the polls of radio listeners showed that. They thought it was a draw, or even that Nixon had won.
Exactly. But on TV,
It was a massacre.
it was. Nixon had recently been hospitalized for a knee infection, so he was about 20 pounds underweight. He looked gaunt.
And he refused professional stage makeup.
He used some drugstore product called Lazy Shave to cover his 5 o'clock shadow. Under the hot studio lights, the makeup just melted. He was sweating, shifting his eyes, and he wore a light gray suit that blended into the background. He looked unwell.
And you contrast that with Kennedy.
Kennedy had been campaigning in California in an open-top convertible, so he was tanned.
Hmm.
He wore a dark blue suit that popped against the gray background. He looked directly at the camera, not at Nixon.
You look like a movie star.
He looked like the future. Nixon looked like the past.
But even with all the style points, he still had this huge obstacle, the Catholic question hanging over his head.
Mm.
It's hard to relate to today, but the anti-Catholic prejudice back then was visceral.
It was massive. The fear was about dual loyalty. People genuinely believed that if a difficult decision came up, Kennedy would have to call the Pope for instructions.
And it threatened to derail his entire campaign, especially in the Protestant South.
It did. So he decided to go right into the lion's den.
The speech to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association.
He stood in front of a room of deeply skeptical Protestant ministers and delivered just an absolute masterclass in secularism. He said, "I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute."
He framed his religion as a private matter that would have zero influence on public policy.
He didn't convince everyone, of course, but it stopped the bleeding. It allowed people to consider him without that one issue dominating everything.
Even with that, the election results were razor thin.
Oh, unbelievably close.
We're talking about a margin of 0.17% in the popular vote. Just over 112,000 votes separated them out of 68 million cast.
It's one of the closest elections in American history. And when you look at the data from a couple of key states, particularly Illinois and Texas, there is significant evidence of what we would politely call irregularities.
You're talking about the Daily Machine in Chicago.
Yes. Mayor Richard Daley famously held back the vote returns from Chicago until the downstate Republican votes came in, ensuring Kennedy would have just enough to win Illinois.
And in Texas, LBJ's home state, there were counties reporting more votes than there were registered voters.
There was an investigative reporter at the time, Earl Mazzo, who actually found proof of dead people voting in Chicago. He had the names, the addresses.
And he took it to Nixon, right?
He did. He took the evidence directly to Nixon, expecting him to contest the election. But Nixon killed the story.
Right.
Nixon decided that challenging the results would cause a massive constitutional crisis right at the height of the Cold War. He conceded for the sake of national stability. It's a moment of statesmanship that often gets overlooked in the later Nixon narrative.
So Kennedy takes office. The torch is passed. He launches this ambitious new frontier.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, when you look at the sources, his domestic legislative record is a bit thin.
It is. He was blocked constantly by a coalition of Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats in Congress.
He really struggled to get bills passed.
He did, but he was brilliant at using the executive power, the bully pulpit, to inspire. The Peace Corps is the prime example.
Right.
Sending young Americans to developing nations. It was a projection of soft power, a counter to Soviet influence that wasn't military.
And of course, the big one, the space race.
We choose to go to the moon.
That speech at Rice University.
He committed the nation to landing a man on the moon before the decade was out. It was an audacious, massive gamble. As you said, the technology didn't exist yet.
Not even close.
But he knew the U.S. needed a unifying, optimistic goal to counter the Soviet successes with Sputnik.
The other major domestic pillar is civil rights. And I think the history books sometimes give JFK a bit too much credit, especially early on. The sources paint him as very, very cautious.
That's accurate. He was a pragmatist. He knew he needed Southern Democrats to pass any legislation, and they were staunch segregationists, so he tried to pay the middle.
He was a balancing act.
Yeah, he'd appoint segregationist judges in the South to appease those senators, while at the same time his brother Bobby, as Attorney General, was sending federal marshals to protect the Freedom Riders.
But the movement forced him off the fence.
The images coming out of Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 changed everything. The police commissioner, Bull Connor.
Turning fire hoses and attack dogs on peaceful protesters.
Our children, the entire world was watching this on television. Kennedy couldn't equivocate anymore. It became an international embarrassment.
And that's when he gave the address to the nation in June of '63.
He completely reframed the issue. He called it a moral issue. He said, "This is not a sectional issue. It is not even a legal or legislative issue alone. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and as a people."
It was the strongest pivot any president had made towards civil rights up to that point.
And it led directly to the introduction of the bill that, after his death, would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
But while he was navigating this moral crisis at home, he was essentially acting as the world's firefighter abroad. His foreign policy record is just a roller coaster. And it starts with a sheer drop.
The Bay of Pigs.
Total disaster.
April 1961, just 3 months into his presidency. It was a disaster he inherited from the Eisenhower administration's CIA, but Kennedy signed off on it.
What was the plan, exactly?
The plan was for CIA-trained Cuban exiles to invade the island at the Bay of Pigs and trigger a popular uprising against Castro.
But the uprising never happened.
No, the Cuban people didn't rise up, and Kennedy, fearing a wider war with the Soviets, made the crucial decision to cancel the U.S. air cover that was supposed to protect the invaders.
So they were just sitting ducks on the beach.
They were slaughtered or captured. It made Kennedy look weak, naive, and incompetent on the world stage. But crucially, it destroyed his trust in the CIA and the military brass.
He felt they had lied to him.
He felt they had lied to him about the chances of success to basically trap him into a full-scale invasion of Cuba. He reportedly told an aide he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
And that animosity is really important context for what comes later.
Very important. But his perceived weakness led directly to the next crisis, the Vienna summit with Khrushchev.
Khrushchev saw blood in the water.
He looked at this young, rich American president who had just failed spectacularly in Cuba, and he thought he could just roll over him. He bullied Kennedy in Vienna, threatening to cut off Western access to Berlin.
Kennedy left that meeting completely shaken.
He told a reporter, "He beat the hell out of me." And just a few weeks later, the Berlin Wall goes up.
A concrete symbol of his failure in Vienna.
Exactly. But all of this, the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin crisis, it was all a prelude to the main event.
October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
This is the closest the human race has ever come to self-annihilation, period.
The U-2 spy plane photos confirmed it. Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed in Cuba.
90 miles from Florida, the flight time to Washington, D.C. was a matter of minutes.
And the reaction inside the White House, in that group they call the XCOM, was terrifying.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military hawks like Curtis LeMay, were unanimous: bomb the missile sites immediately, invade Cuba, destroy the Castro regime.
And if Kennedy had followed their advice,
we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. We now know from Soviet archives that the field commanders in Cuba had tactical nuclear weapons.
and the authority to use them.
And the authority to use them if invaded. An American invasion would have triggered a tactical nuclear response, which would have triggered a full-scale U.S. nuclear counterstrike on the Soviet Union. End of the world.
But Kennedy, having learned from the Bay of Pigs, he pushed back.
He did. He refused to be railroaded by his generals. He chose the quarantine, a naval blockade of Cuba.
Which was really a brilliant move. It was an act of aggression, but it wasn't an act of war. It bought time.
For 13 days, the world just held its breath. It came down to a secret back-channel deal.
What was the public deal?
Publicly, the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba if the Soviets withdrew the missiles.
But privately, there was another piece.
The crucial piece. Bobby Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, and agreed that the U.S. would quietly remove its obsolete Jupiter missiles from Turkey at a later date.
That Turkey deal was the key. It allowed Khrushchev to save face. He could tell the Politburo he'd traded their missiles in Cuba for American missiles in Turkey.
It showed Kennedy's maturity as a statesman. He ignored the generals who wanted war and found a diplomatic off-ramp. He learned the lesson of the Bay of Pigs. Don't trust the military experts blindly.
But speaking of military experts and blind trust, we have to open the file on Vietnam. The outline calls this the enigma.
It is the great what-if of his presidency, and the facts on the surface are not good. When Kennedy took office, there were a few hundred American advisors in Vietnam.
And by the time he died,
there were over 16,000. He was escalating. He believed in the domino theory that if South Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would fall to communism.
and he also sanctioned the coup against President Diem in South Vietnam.
Correct. Diem was a corrupt and ineffective leader, but he was our guy. His administration approved the coup, and Diem was assassinated on November 2nd, 1963. Kennedy was reportedly shocked and appalled by the murder, but his administration had absolutely greenlit the coup that led to it.
So all of that points to a president who is digging deeper into the Vietnam quagmire.
It does, however.
There's this document, National Security Action Memorandum 263, NSSAM 263. It was signed October 11, 1963.
This is the pivot point. This is what researchers who believe he wanted out always point to.
What does it say?
NSSAM 263 specifically authorized the withdrawal of 1,000 U.S. military personnel by the end of 1963. And more importantly, it stated a plan to have the bulk of U.S. personnel withdrawn by the end of 1965.
So he was planning to get out.
That is the argument. The sources suggest he told close aides that he couldn't pull out completely before the 1964 election because he'd be crucified by Republicans like Barry Goldwater for being soft on communism. The plan was to win re-election, then cut ties with Vietnam.
This creates a massive conflict of interest for certain powerful groups.
A huge one.
If the military-industrial complex and the hardliners in the CIA wanted a war in Vietnam, which became a massive profit engine, and Kennedy was privately threatening to shut it all down after '64...
You have a motive for his removal. And that leads us inevitably to the dark conclusion of the story. Dallas, November 22nd, 1963.
The motorcade at Dealey Plaza. The shots ring out. The official story from the Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Simple. Case closed.
But the American public never fully bought it, and frankly, neither did the U.S. government later on.
You're referring to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 70s.
Yes. In 1979, they reopened the entire investigation. They reviewed all the evidence, and they concluded, based on acoustic evidence from a police dictabelt recording from Dealey Plaza, that there was a high probability of a second gunman firing from the grassy knoll.
So they essentially declared it a conspiracy.
They did. Their final report says he was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. They just couldn't name the conspirators. But they officially ruled out the lone nut theory.
And when you look at the enemies Kennedy had made in just 1,000 days, the list of potential conspirators is long.
Very long.
We already talked about the CIA.
The CIA theory is compelling. You have men like Allen Dulles, whom Kennedy fired after the Bay of Pigs. There was a deep-seated hatred in the agency. They viewed Kennedy as a liability, as a president who wouldn't pull the trigger when they felt it was necessary, like during the missile crisis.
Then there's the mafia connection.
This one is very sticky. We know from the sources that the mafia, specifically Sam Giancana and the Chicago outfit, helped deliver votes for Kennedy in Illinois in 1960.
They expected a friend in the White House.
Instead, they got his brother, Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, who launched the most aggressive, relentless crusade against organized crime in American history.
Carlos Marcello, the mob boss of New Orleans, was deported by Bobby. There are accounts that he famously threatened to take out the stone in his shoe, meaning JFK, to stop Bobby's crusade.
So you have the mob feeling betrayed, the CIA feeling handcuffed, the military-industrial complex fearing a withdrawal from Vietnam.
It's a convergence of incredibly powerful interests, all of whom, you could argue, benefited from Lyndon Johnson assuming the presidency.
Because the first thing Johnson did was reverse Kennedy's Vietnam policy.
Immediately.
Days after the assassination, Johnson signed NSM 273, which opened the door for escalation. And then came the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The war happened, exactly as the Hawks had wanted.
So whether it was a vast conspiracy or just one lone gunman, the result was the same. The man was gone. But almost immediately, the myth began. And it was started single-handedly by Jackie.
It was a brilliant and I think desperate act of narrative control. Just 1 week after the assassination, Jackie invited Theodore White from Life magazine to the family compound in Hyannisport.
She was afraid, wasn't she? That he'd be remembered by bitter men who would write the history books.
Exactly. She didn't want him remembered as just another politician with a mixed record. She told White that at night, Jack liked to listen to the soundtrack of the popular Broadway musical at the time, Camelot.
And she gave him the line, the one that defined everything.
She gave him the line, "Don't let it be forgotten that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot."
And that stuck. It completely framed his presidency, not as a series of messy political struggles, but as a lost golden age.
It elevated him from a president to the level of King Arthur, a legend.
But as we've discussed throughout this, the reality was so much messier. The post-70s revelations about the affairs, Judith Exner, who was a conduit between Kennedy and the mob boss, Sam Giancana.
The health cover-ups. The wiretapping of Martin Luther King Jr. that his administration authorized.
The flaws were real and they were significant.
They were. But I think the reason Kennedy endures, the reason he consistently polls as one of the greatest presidents despite his short term, is because of what he represented.
Possibility.
He represented possibility. He asked the country to do hard things.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
Exactly. He made public service feel noble. He made politics feel like a shared adventure, even if the Camelot image was a mask. The inspiration he sparked in the Peace Corps, in the Civil Rights Movement, in the space program, that was real.
And his death marked a very distinct loss of innocence for the country.
It absolutely did. You can almost draw a line. Before November 22, 1963, there was this post-war sense of optimism. After, we spiral into the chaos of the late 60s, the Vietnam quagmire, the riots, the assassinations of MLK and his brother Bobby, Watergate. It felt like the wheels just came off the American experiment.
It leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? If he had lived, would the 1960s have been different? Would those 58,000 names on the Vietnam Wall be alive today?
Or was the momentum of history too strong? Was the war in Vietnam inevitable regardless of who sat in that chair? We will never, ever know. But the fact that we are still debating it, still digging through the files for the truth, shows that his presidency, as unfinished as it was, cast a shadow that we are all still living in today.
A legacy of hope, wrapped in a tragedy and hidden inside a mystery. It really is a story that never ends.
And that is why we keep digging.
If you found this deep dive into the life of JFK fascinating, and you want to support our mission to uncover these stories, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe to the History Titans channel. It really helps us keep the archives open. Thanks for listening.
Stay curious.